From the Cube studios in Palo Alto and Boston, bringing you data-driven insights from the Cube and ETR. This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
Intel's new CEO has promised to clean up the balance sheet, slim down the company, return to a culture focused on engineering, sharpen its customer focus, shore up its product line, become a world-class independent foundry, and lead Intel for as long as it takes to achieve success, however that is going to be defined. As our audience knows, unlike most other analysts, we've aggressively emphasized the icebergs ahead for Intel since way back in 2013, culminating in our prediction that Intel would go bankrupt trying to execute on its most previous strategy. While we would have preferred a different approach to Intel's Foundry, i.e. a joint venture with TSM, Lip-Bu at least has what we consider to be a viable go-forward plan. The steady-state outcome of this new direction, however, is far from certain. Now, our current thinking is, in addition to LBT's structural changes, that Intel has to execute on the following four strategies. One, refocus products on its core PC device heritage to win back that market before others fill the gaps that it has opened. Two, innovate on the product portfolio side in AI PCs, edge, and robotics by drafting off of specifically NVIDIA's AI successes, but filling what we see as holes in NVIDIA's product capabilities. Third, intelligently partnering with TSM, ARM, and RISC-V for Intel's own designs, and four, keep its foot in the foundry door as a precious resource for the U.S. onshore advanced manufacturing imperative. Hello and welcome to this week's theCUBE Research Insights powered by ETR. In this breaking analysis, David Floyer and I update you on our latest thinking about whither Intel. We'll review some striking data on Intel's ascendancy, how its fall from grace eerily echoes that of IBM's 35 years ago, the daunting task of competing in Foundry, its product outlook going forward, and how we would approach the future, and a map of how the data center landscape has changed and what it might look like in the next several years. Now, first of all, David, welcome. Great to be working with you. As always, really appreciate the effort, the data, and the time, and your perspectives. Thank you for coming on.
Welcome. It's been great to work with you again, and I think we've got some important facts to discuss. And I was part of IBM when it went under, so that was the reason I joined IDC all those years ago. So,
yeah, indeed. And it didn't quite go under, but gee, it almost did. Yeah. Well, let's get into it. I mean, this is one of our favorite topics. The rise and fall of x86 has been remarkable to document, and we've done that. This chart goes back to 1985, and it shows x86's really amazing run. It grew from a tiny slice of the market in the 1980s to dominate not only PC, but also data center markets, and we're going to talk about that. And as we've discussed many times, its volume advantage in PCs allowed it to completely dominate the mini-computer and RISC-based Unix systems at the time with superior economics and better price performance, and of course its ecosystem leverage. And ironically, as you can see on this chart, the x86 market started to get a little toppy early last decade, but then it bounced back during COVID, and that's something that we're going to discuss later in the parallels that David was just alluding to at IBM. But David, this was truly a remarkable run by Intel specifically and x86 generally, and have you shown in that chart with AMD also playing a pivotal role. Your thoughts?
It is just a magnificent journey that Intel took. It really is magnificent. They took the PC, they drove it as hard as they could, then they took advantage of their low-cost volumes for the server market, and they really did an outstanding job of preserving the x86 as the leading semiconductors.
Yeah, so we do look back at history. It maybe is a little bit redundant, but it's also instructive. And so Intel's PC chip revenue and volume, it's exploded over those 15 years. And, thanks to that Wintel monopoly that's been well documented and the tight relationship between those two firms. and of course their respective ecosystems. So Intel became the largest semiconductor manufacturer in the world during that time, surpassing all the pure play silicon companies, and of course IBM as well, which was dominant in the day, and everyone. And as Intel took over the PC space, David, the enterprise got really crowded as everyone, they got squeezed out of the PC market. So what they do? They went up market. And as shown in the previous chart on that brown shade that we saw, you can see it within the insert here. PC volumes conferred value to x86, and then that allowed Intel to wipe out HP, IBM, Sun, and anyone else in their way in the enterprise, to the point where Intel had nearly all of the data center market, well over 90% by the 2000s. Your thoughts?
Yes. I like to think about these things in terms of value, volume, value, and velocity. And what Intel did was create the volume, and that enabled them to drive down cost. And they and Microsoft created the value behind it. And then between them, they took away all of the impediments to adoption and therefore the ability to increase velocity. And they did a magnificent job. It was both Intel and Microsoft working together that was the secret sauce.
So meanwhile, as this has been very well documented, these little toys from Apple, like the iPod, started to capture the imagination of consumers, and the Apple ARM TSM ecosystem began to form with better economics, lower power, much more efficient designs, longer battery lives, faster time to tape out, and things began to slowly change in the marketplace. And it's been discussed extensively that Intel passed on the original iPhone design. It was written, we talked about it before Chip War came out, Chris Miller, but he also documented. But what's not as widely known is that Intel was also asked by Apple to bid on making the chips for the iPhone, being the foundry for the iPhone. And this was catalyzed because initially iPhone chip manufacturing was done by Samsung, but then they chose to compete with the iPhone and make their own phones, and Apple was like, we're not going to do that. But Apple looked at Intel's capabilities and concluded that Morris Chang's TSMC was the better choice because, then quoting, Intel is not a foundry. And David, this is according to accounts shared by Morris Chang, and they haven't been widely reported, but it's interesting that Apple gave Intel an opportunity to do so.
They gave them 3 months to come up with a plan, and their initial requirement was that Apple would convert everything over to the x86, one of the more smaller versions of x86. But then they did try and get agreement to become a foundry for them. But Tim Cook very, very clearly said to Morris Chang, Intel is not a foundry.
Yeah, so both sides, Otolini and company had the opportunity to bid on the chip design, and they passed because Otolini even said that was a big mistake. We should have done that. But anyway, so all this caught our attention, actually David Floyer's attention, who came to me in 2013 sounding the alarm on Intel if significant changes were not enacted immediately. And you see, folks, David Floyer spent decades at IBM and saw this play out in mainframe slow motion. So we're going to come back to that a little bit, but in 2013, Floyer pinpointed the momentum that ARM had and its economics advantage. And as we show in the insert here in the upper left, he forecast the steep decline of x86 volumes and the rapid ascendancy of ARM-based designs. But David, these were easy figures to ignore because they were unit volumes, not revenue, not profit. But you knew at the time that unit volume would potentially confer advantages to the newcomers. And then one other thing, David, I remember at the time you always had these notes. Your data always has little tiny notes. And one of the caveats was that this scenario assumes Intel does nothing. And I remember thinking, oh, okay, that's a reasonable assumption that you're making that caveat. But astoundingly, Intel essentially did nothing about this threat. It really lost its paranoia. To quote Andy Grove, only the paranoid survive. And it really was a monumental decision. David, what do you think about that?
Yes, I mean, I looked at the history of IBM being caught out by the CMOS chips, etc., and then the mainframe just fell because it was too expensive. It didn't have the volume, and what we talked about before. So it was my belief in volume being the key thing, and it was very, very clear that the mobile market was huge volumes. Even in 2013, it had already overtaken Intel in volume and was only going up and up and up and up. And that was going to cause Intel severe problems. You know, I was a little early and when it would happen, but I wasn't off by too much.
Yeah, so as all this was happening kind of underneath the iceberg, not a lot of people were talking about it in the enterprise, like virtually nobody. You had these low-cost, high-volume, low-margin mobile markets that nobody was paying attention to. Meanwhile, Intel's dominance in the data center, that looked like it was growing. And so kind of post.com, Intel took over the data center, they wiped out RISC Unix, and they rode that wave, and then they rode the cloud computing wave. So they hopped on that when cloud's ascendancy was taken off. Well, of course, x86 was, a dominant player there. We've also documented well how AWS started working with Annapurna to reduce its reliance on Intel. It was at first it tried AMD. The x86 was the blocker, so it started to design its own, and those were again initial signs. But anyway, as that was going on, then COVID hits, and we saw a massive rebound in PC because of work from home. So volumes exploded. Dell's PC volumes, went up, and many claimed that x86 was alive and well. In fact, I think, Gelsinger, even on one of the conference calls, I think he made a bet. Crawford Del Pret told me he made a bet with Crawford that PC volumes would actually, continue to grow well past COVID. That didn't happen. But so all this was a false front as x86 peaked during COVID. And this is where the echoes of the ghosts that plagued IBM returned to our story. So x86 revenue peaked in 2020, as we showed previously in an earlier chart, and Intel's data center revenues also peaked. And so this arrow points to what we call on the right a dead cat bounce, reminiscent of IBM in 1990. That year, IBM recorded what at the time was record revenue. And its profit relative to 1989 grew 62%. I remember I was at IDC reading the annual report and just, being blown away and surprised at how well IBM was doing because we could see this microprocessor-based revolution happening. And of course, that is what happened. The following, in fact, it was part of the culture at IDC. We had been predicting this since 1987. Finally happened in 1991, 92, and 93. 3 following years after IBM's revenue peaked, and it marked the most painful in the history of IBM with dramatic losses of momentum, huge profit losses, and internal chaos where they were trying to figure out what to do. Remember, David, they were going to split up the company, and that was John Akers' plan, and Gerstner came in and sort of pivoted on that. Years later, IBM, which was the world's premier semiconductor manufacturer, years ago, was forced to pay Global Foundries $1.5 billion to take IBM Microelectronics, which was the company's semiconductor manufacturing arm, off its hands. And the catalyst to all this, again, was the shift to microprocessor-based systems, which had higher volume, as we showed in the first slide, with the dramatic ascendancy of x86. So it mirrors the post-ChatGPT rise in NVIDIA's accelerated computing architecture, what we refer to, David, you coined this term, extreme parallel processing. No pun intended, but the parallels are quite stark, aren't they?
That's a nice one. Yes. And whereas before with IBM and with Intel against the Unix boxes, it was similar types of architecture that overtook one from the other. The extreme parallel processing is a completely new and has enormous increased value. And that's the reason for its very, very steep increase in the rate that OpenAI has grown, and with it has grown all of the data centers to support AI. And this change was difficult to foresee. I don't think there are very many people that saw that at that degree. But that change means it's a completely different market. There is a new market, and instead of Intel and Microsoft, it is NVIDIA who is setting the stage.
Right, indeed, and that's all the hype these days. So let's take a little detour and talk about Intel's Foundry business. We have literally beat a dead horse on this issue, using Wright's Law as a framework for understanding why Intel would virtually never be able to catch TSM, without unlimited capital and virtually unlimited time. So let's take a look at the fundamental problem through a little bit of a different perspective. Here we show TSMC compared to Intel's Foundry business, and you see the stats for TSM: $105 billion in plant, property, and equipment on the balance sheet, $88 billion in revenue, 50% gross margin. I mean, it's not outrageous. I mean, Foundry's a hard business, and especially considering TSM's an N of 1, and decent profit. Don't get me wrong, but it's not like NVIDIA margins. But at any rate, the key metric here is highlighted in red, David, that you're showing. The ratio of revenue to PPE is 83%. And then when you compare that to Intel, you got 109 billion of PPE on its balance sheet overall. We don't know exactly how much is related to the Foundry, but we know it's the majority, as we see in the notes on the right-hand side from Intel's 10K. I remember, David, at IDC when I was first, being trained on how to do analysis. A gentleman named Peter Cohen, I don't know if you remember him. Yeah, and he taught us how to read annual reports in 10Ks, and he used to always stress, read the notes. This is why we read the notes. And so you see that on the right. So David's pegged Foundry PPE at 100 billion, assuming 90% of the PPE is for Foundry. That's of the overall PPE is pretty reasonable. So Intel's Foundry revenue is 17.5 billion, the vast majority of which comes from its own captive business. And it's got an overall gross margin. The company's overall gross margin, 36%. I mean, you remember it was mid-60s at Intel's peak. And so it lost nearly $20 billion in 2024 on a GAAP basis due to Foundry and all these write-offs. And so the key metric here, again in red by comparison, is 17.5% of revenue to PPE ratio, much, much lower than that, David, of TSM. So the effective utilization of Intel's PPE, if you apply TSM best practices, is what you've done here, is really 21 billion. So David, that says $80 billion is underutilized, and you've made this point to me many times. It's ripe for being written off. And I really believe this is one reason that the plan that you and I put together, the bold scenario for spinning out Foundry and creating a new joint venture with TSM, didn't happen. There were other reasons, of course, but Intel's board and its investors probably didn't want to repeat IBM's microelectronics debacle and have to pay somebody to take it, because there really wasn't value there in the Foundry. It's of negative value, and they wouldn't accept the fact that the Foundries had negative value. But, Lip Boutin says Intel intends to become a world-class Foundry. So David, before you comment, let's listen to Diane Bryant, who's the former head of Intel's data center business when it was at its peak. Here's what she said about Foundry. Please play the clip.
Which has its own set of problems, which are similar but different.
Yes. So number one, I am so excited that Lip-Bu is leading Intel. I mean, that was just a huge sigh of relief. I was there 32 years. Yeah. I was there when Andy Grove was the CEO. Gordon Moore sat down the aisle. I mean, I love that company so much, and to watch it degrade over time was very painful, like losing a child. And so the announcement that Lip-Bu and his willingness to walk in and make it happen, God bless him. Intel's tried 5 times to build a foundry in the 32 years that I worked at Intel. 5 times we tried. It's leadership, and it's making it a priority. Anything can be done. It's, I mean, come on, look at the invention that happens every day. Intel can have a very successful foundry. How long does it take to, catch up and be leading edge, it's hard. Under the prior CEOs, Intel lost 2 nodes, 2 nodes behind. And if you could leapfrog and all of a sudden jump 2 nodes, well, then Moore's law would have been you can double performance every 1 year, which is you can't do it. So it'll take a while. But I will also say, think of how many chips there are in the world. They don't all need leading edge, right? There's a huge.
You could do 6 nanometers on an IoT device.
I agree with that, but we come back to my question: how important is it for a U.S. domicile?
Oh, it is very important.
So, David, Diane was pretty forceful that Intel has tried and failed 5 times, but she's expressing some degree of optimism in LBT's leadership and the potential to turn Foundry around. And her point is that Intel doesn't have to be on the bleeding edge of nodes. And while that's true, it suggests there's going to be no U.S. domiciled company at the bleeding edge of semis. Certainly, this is more viable than trying to ship 14A on or before 2027, which was Pat's original promise for 1.4 nanometer. Of course, you knew and we knew it would not likely happen. What are your thoughts on all this and the future of Intel Foundry?
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the reasons that was given for not taking these deals with TSMC was that they thought they should be selling it at, $100 billion in value. And anybody who looks at this knows that the real value is at best a quarter of that. And historically, IBM and AMD had to pay global foundries to take it off their hands. So they were in a very difficult position. My own view is that I'm cautiously optimistic that the new leader will not make the same mistakes of over-investing in this area, will take a much gentler approach, and hopefully over time that they can grow their capabilities. But it's a long, very long journey to get their foundry business into profitability and contributing to Intel. And, I would think it's 50-50 at best.
All right, so we're going to get back to this topic at the end, but let's talk about this new era that is going to be here for a while, by all accounts. The extreme parallel processing market, or accelerated computing, or neural processing, is being driven, of course, by a new leader. That's NVIDIA. So it's not only Intel, it's also Microsoft in a way. It's kind of Wintel in this new era. It's got CUDA, its libraries, and other software. So it's like Win-Intel. NVIDIA is leveraging ARM-based designs. Can you imagine if NVIDIA were allowed to buy ARM back when it was trying to buy them pre ChatGPT? Wow, that would have been really dominant. It's already dominant, but anyway, that's an aside. But it works very closely with TSM. Of course, that is the NVIDIA Foundry. It's a true system designer, building racks and full end-to-end systems. It's got an expanding software stack. It's creating a new category of cloud computing, neoclouds. It's invested in CoreWeave, and you've got others that are emerging, like Genesis and Chase Lockmiller's company as well, whom we've had on a number of times, Caruso, and many, many others. So that's kind of interesting, those specialists. But David, NVIDIA is putting up numbers like we've never seen before, surpassing anything Intel ever did. So how should we think about NVIDIA's role in this new world, and what does it all mean for the discussion that we've been having?
Well, NVIDIA is going to set the standards in the data center. It has already. It has set networking standards. It's set DB standards. It's set the software standards with CUDA. Every developer wants to use CUDA because that's the fastest way for them to produce results and the most efficient way of using GPUs. So they have built up a software, hardware set of standards, which is going to be the set of standards that everybody uses in the industry. Elon Musk was interviewed the other day, and he was asked, how many GPUs he was going to get and who he was going to get them from. And he said, well, as many as we can get. Essentially, we will take them from NVIDIA. They're by far away the best. We might take a little bit from AMD. And then he was asked whether he would go forward with his own investments, which Tesla made big investments in their own neural cloud network. And he said, no, we're going with NVIDIA. So the whole standard has been set. So from the reason for this is important is that anybody who wants to work in this area has to abide by those standards and has got to use those standards. For example, VAST is using them very, very effectively in the storage area. And Intel has to do the same thing. It has to add value to that huge market that's been created.
All right, so let's come back to this sort of theme of whether x86, Intel, and AMD, whether as into what place or state is what we mean by that. So AMD is also, of course, exposed to these market shifts because it's got a high reliance on x86 market, which is in steady decline. It's this sort of managed down business. Intel, it's under attack from all sides, including its core business, as AMD is outgunning Intel with better product in its core. So Intel really had let its guard down, and they've been forced even to partner with AMD to try and keep the x86 alive, building up the ecosystem. And AMD is like, yeah, sure, we'll join forces with you, and keep kicking butt. But again, they're sort of birds of a feather in that sense, even though AMD clearly is ahead on GPUs. But how do you see the Intel AMD dynamic playing out, David?
That's a very good question. I mean, the most logical thing for them to do is combine in some way, but I don't see how that would happen because of the Foundry business. But that would be the most logical thing for them to do is combine forces, because they're essentially competing against each other. And AMD has taken an equal market share of the server marketplace. And if you ask any gamer, the best gaming machine in town, it's AMD. So they really have driven their partnership with TSMC very, very hard. And this is the difference. If Intel is not careful, this difference will grow over time. So Intel is in a very dangerous position and has to make sure that its products are competitive in the x86 marketplace. So it's good news for people in x86. I think these two making their products better will mean that the x86 market, even if it's declining, will be better value.
All right, so let's talk about where Intel should go from here, where we think it may go, will go, should go. So let's start with the Foundry. To keep Foundry viable, it needs wafer scale volume. So it's got to lean into ARM and RISC-V for both its own internal designs and, of course, to attract external customers. That's a way to get there, at least partially. But in the meantime, for its advanced designs, it's got to go to TSM in order to shore up its PC and server business and compete with AMD to get its volume up and get to market faster. Now, I want you to dig into the scenario, David, shown here around drafting off of NVIDIA with this emerging market of mobile edge and robotics that we see happening. It's going to be much larger, you claim, than x86 ever was by our prediction here. So, David, where are the gaps in NVIDIA's products? What is Intel's opportunity, and what do they have to do, in your opinion, to succeed here, especially in terms of adopting NVIDIA standards? And how does Intel differentiate and not just become the AMD of NVIDIA?
Well, I think there are two distinct marketplaces that NVIDIA have created. The first is the cloud marketplace, the AI cloud marketplace, which OpenAI is using. And that is something that NVIDIA have got in the order of 75, 80% of that market. And they should be able to dominate. There are other players that will come in and support them, but they will dominate that market. However, in the area of much smaller systems, distributed systems, the systems for workstations, for PCs, for robotics, and for the edge, there will need to be a much cheaper way of doing it, in my view. That marketplace itself will grow. It's going to take longer to start, but it will grow to be proportionally, not quite as high, but proportionally grow very fast indeed, and be a very big market. Which, several times, in my view, are that of the PC x86 market today. So that's the opportunity for me to invent new ways of doing things, particularly by using ARM, making technologies that will allow people with x86 to move easily to the new environment from x86 to ARM, taking advantage of risk, much lower potential costs of RISC-V, especially in some of the edge devices, etc. There is a very big market that's developing, and NVIDIA really have used their technology they use for the data center and just try to bring it down. I don't think that's very efficient. And I think there is a big opportunity for Intel to go into that marketplace and use its expertise in small systems and develop some expertise in mobile and edge and things like that. And there is a big marketplace to go after. And that's a much more productive marketplace than trying to hang on to the server marketplace. I don't think they had any hope of beating NVIDIA in that marketplace.
All right, so let's stay with this slide. It's kind of apologize for the word salad here, but let's focus on Foundry. And the point is, it's got to cut headcount, and it's got to get focused. And for the things that we talked about before, improving the utilization of its PPE, and gear up for these emerging markets and keep close to the U.S. government. David, put a finer point on these assertions as well.
Well, let's just take one of those. In particular, there is definitely a marketplace, a very, very important marketplace for the military, for the government, for secure systems. And NVIDIA brought in their own security on a system, which is very good. And in my view, Intel should build on that and make a space for the very high requirements of the military and government. Again, they can make a difference there. They've got very good rapport with those people. I think that's a major opportunity for them to create something new, but still based on the NVIDIA standards.
All right, let's close with some older kind of ETR DNA and a slide that we used in 2021 to depict data center markets of the future. This, of course, was prior to the AI heard around the world, aka the announcement of ChatGPT. So you all have seen this chart before. It's an XY axis. The vertical axis is net score, and the horizontal axis is market share. Don't read too much into the exact positioning. What we wanted to do back in April of 2021, when David and I first presented this chart, was we just wanted to show some of the landscape. And at the time, you could see that where we put Intel and AMD, NVIDIA, this is again before ChatGPT, OpenAI wasn't even on here, so we sort of placed them on here. You got AWS and VMware and Cisco and others, HPE, but the real focus, Microsoft, et cetera, but the real focus here we want to call your attention to is, let's start with NVIDIA. NVIDIA's gone from, major player to the player. So they are, up and to the right. So they're kind of number one. Intel, for its part, has swapped places essentially with AMD. You can see ARM, which it was always pretty well positioned in the enterprise, per our conversations in the past about Nitro, Graviton, and many breaking analysis we've done on ARM, really seeping into the enterprise for all those same dynamics that we talked about with the PC. We're seeing in ARM, so it's ascending to the right. Google Cloud Platform with TPUs and its chops in AI and Gemini and Vertex and its position, we think is clearly improved. And there's a bunch of chip startups that we've kind of put here on the chart. We'll see how many of those make it through the knothole. These guys are like, SEMA AI and Cerebrus and many others. D-Matrix and some of the folks that we've had on, we profiled recently at the edge. And that's kind of a really interesting emerging market. But really the other really important one here is China. And David, you kind of alluded to this earlier in one of your charts where you said, if TSM takes over or China takes over Taiwan, gets control of TSM, let's play that out for a second. Let's say Xi has said that he's going to do that China is going to take over Taiwan. So let's assume that happens before the end of the decade. I think it's safe to say that Intel's Foundry is not going to achieve its objectives in the next 2 to 3 years. It's probably going to take the better part of a decade at least for them to get to where they want to get. That's given your 50-50 scenario, even if they can get there. So if in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, China takes over Taiwan, now there is no, so right now you could say, okay, TSM is onshore. Now maybe they'll bring expertise, maybe they'll bring IP over, but let's assume they're N-1, maybe even N-2 behind what's going on in Taiwan at TSM. Lower cost, all the best IP, the Glengarry IP, if you will. And so if that happens, and maybe it's not even an if, it might be a when. Now it comes back to the key questions that we've consistently been asking about this. Number one, is it important to have advanced U.S. manufacturing or advanced manufacturing of semiconductors onshore in the U.S.? Yes, we all agree that's the case. Many have decided that TSM in its current form and its investments that it's making satisfies that requirement. Let's assume it does. Second question, is it important, and I would ask even differently, is it vital that there is a U.S. domiciled headquartered company that is capable of developing advanced chips? And I would say yes. Others have said no. I asked this question to Matt Garman last December at reInvent, and he said yes on number one. I'm not sure on number two. I asked him if he wants to fund it. He said definitely not. Number three. He didn't say definitely not. He said, I don't think so. We put forth this bold plan to spin out Foundry and create a joint venture with TSM and the U.S. government and other shareholders with infusion of capital from some of the big hyperscalers and NVIDIA and Facebook and some others. That didn't fly, obviously. The U.S. government, the administration doesn't feel like that's necessary. Intel didn't want to give up for many of the reasons that we talked about. It's Foundry for free or for negative value. And so now we are here. The interesting point Diane Bryant made is we don't have to be leading edge. I would argue you actually do have to be leading edge for the interest of the U.S. So will that be satisfied by TSM? See, to me, David, the conundrum is I'm not sure TSM will ever have bleeding edge onshore. Now, if China gets control of that technology, just as we've seen with rare earth metals, it takes a lot of effort and a lot of heavy lifting through negotiation and, other geopolitical maneuvering to get to a point where maybe you can secure access to those critical materials. And so my view is the U.S. government has made a mistake. Intel, for economic reasons, has chosen not to go that direction. And as a result, in the event that China takes over Taiwan and gets control of TSM, it puts the United States and its military in a much more precarious position. And I think it was a missed opportunity to not go forward with a more bold plan to secure leading edge, advanced U.S. manufacturing by a U.S. domiciled company, even though it would probably take 8 to 10 years to get there. I'll give you the final thoughts.
And I agree. In fact, I would go even further. And I believe when China takes over Taiwan, there are a number of options on the table. One of which is that TSMC gets bombed by one side or the other and doesn't exist anymore. The other is that most likely is that China will take over TSMC, and then it has the bargaining in terms of supplying that one way or the other to the U.S., either with very large tariffs, either on one side or on both sides, which will increase the cost dramatically for the U.S. But even more important than that, to me, is that there is a race on to adopt AI effectively in every part of the economy, and especially in the military. And if this happens, and we do not have a foundries which can produce the latest and greatest chips, we will be at a very distinct disadvantage in terms of the cost of developing AI and in terms of capability of AI, in terms of the smallness of the chips, etc., that will go into drones or whatever else is being built. So I think there is a significant risk to the U.S., and I really do believe that the idea of making an agreement with TSM and having a U.S.-based company is by far and away the safest way for the U.S.
Okay, thank you. And it doesn't appear that is going to happen anytime soon. Remember, it was quite some time after IBM's shock and fall from grace, almost 10 years, that it chose to divest of its microelectronics business. So it took quite a time. It's like the Lord of the Rings, the ring, precious. They don't want to let it go. Took Jerry Sanders a long time to give up Foundry with AMD, and look what happened afterwards. Look at IBM. IBM is, finally thriving again. But so we'll see. It's very possible that Intel is going to face the same fate and eventually will be forced to spin out its Foundry. We shall see. Well, David, thank you for the great analysis, and as always, thanks for the collaboration.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we're going to leave it right there. Thanks to Ken Schiffman, who's leading production today, and also Alex Meyerson, who helps out and runs the podcasts. Kristen Martin and Cheryl Knight help get the word out on social media and in our newsletters, and Rob Hof is our editor-in-chief over at siliconangle.com. Remember, all these episodes are available as podcasts wherever you listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast. I publish each week on thecuberesearch.com and siliconangle.com. You can email me at david.vellante@siliconangle.com or DM me at dvellante or comment on my LinkedIn post. And check out ETR.ai. They got great survey data, the best in the enterprise tech business. This is Dave Vellante For David Floyer and the Cube Research Insights powered by ETR. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on Breaking Analysis.